So I'm a bit with you, Cara, in this issue of measuring. I've talked about demonstrating, which puts a bit of an onus back on the researchers. I wanted to say these kind of obvious things that we know about this increasing focus on technology, and that I expect is the big issue in this country, and then really is to mention that it's not a magic bullet and it's more than science, and really to look at this in a wider sense in terms of social innovation. And to refer to this document, which had quite a difficult gestation and eventually was published, but was called Playing to Our Strengths, which we published here through the Higher Education Authority, in terms of the notion that the expectation, that science, engineering, technology, research best suited to create jobs misunderstands the notion of creativity, understates the importance of the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and in terms of the contribution that it makes to economic sustainability, quality of life, attractive place to live, work, and do business. Then I expect what I really want to go on to is this notion of higher education as the engine of the economy. Part of that, it seems to me, is this whole argument that higher education is put up for a very long time, in which it is argued that it is. We go from Castells and positioning it, I'm not arguing whether that's the case or it's not the case, but we have certainly argued it's the case. And it is then, it poses profound challenges, not just to all the arts and humanities, but also to all researchers, because it effectively, people then turn around, particularly now, and say, show me. Show me how you are this big contribution. The emphasis on products and services, not just in the Irish case, but I think, as I pointed out yesterday, Horizon 2020, there's an increasing focus on market-driven or application-focused research, and the gauntlet is really passed down to us. And the question then is, how do the arts and humanities respond to the new policy regime? Does it ignore the new demands? How does it engage with it? Does it argue disciplinary exceptionalism? Or should the same rules apply? And what lessons can be learned about how the scientists have positioned themselves? And in that regard, just going back to the kinds of arguments that came from the US with Van Hauer Bush and the whole science endless frontier in the post-World War II period, about which effectively established the social contract, the understanding that in the period, which was the whole argument that the more we pump in to research on the idea that it is actually going to lead to social and economic progress. So that, the frontier, the document says, new products, industries, and jobs require continuous additions to the knowledge and laws of nature, applications of that knowledge to practical purposes. And without scientific progress, no achievements can be, no progress can be achieved. But it's that closer alignment, and we've had a whole lot of discussion about whether it's true or it's not true. But nonetheless, it has set the basis for structured governmental funding on this assumption that if you pump in the money, that the contract between government and university-based research, funding is provided as long as there are what are seen as usable outputs, and they are justifiable. Alternatively, or not necessarily alternatively, but moving on, there is the emergence of what is called an engaged scholarship. Much more of a discussion in the US than I think it is elsewhere, coming out of Ernst Boyer's work on the scholarship and so on, which he did for Carnegie in the 90s, in which it basically was an argument against a very narrow understanding of what is research. And there is increasingly, he talks about 4 scholarships and so on, but nevertheless, there's increasing recognition of a wider understanding of what do we mean by it. Talking about challenge-oriented use, all these different terms now used, rather than this crudely apportioning in a hierarchical way between fundamental and applied, which I think is a really facile and very useless argument. And we now see increasingly that researchers are themselves active promoters of an engaged scholarship. Much more recognition that research doesn't operate in isolation, and even to an extent to which nature got itself in on the act, in which it's basically saying researchers in cities need to stop turning their back on the cities in which they live and then give something back to it. So it then seems to me that once researchers seem to have value and impact beyond the academy, then what's measured, how and by whom and all that needs to change. And we also then, which was also discussed by varying of our speakers through the conference, was a whole issue about the democratization of knowledge, accessing to and participation in it, not just the issues which we've got about co-production of knowledge, where it's done, who's involved, but also the wider range of tools. Everyone is now accessible to the kinds of tools which we've got. We've mentioned some of these, but open source, digital repositories, we're all certainly all pushing that here. But once you get into that and you've got a wider audience, then you have a wider discussion about what it is. And so as a consequence, the issues about greater public accessibility means that peer review can no longer be necessarily the primary or sole method by which research is assessed. That the end user or stakeholder esteem becomes an incredibly important component. And that we're now talking about a broader range of indicators and methodologies than the traditional bibliometric processes. So what is to be done? Much greater commonality with other disciplines. I think we've had that discussion. Not just the maths, but across the piece. Seems to me there's a lot. I expect one of the things that I would say in this as well, which I haven't actually listed, is that we've talked a lot about the humanities, but very little about the creative arts. And there is a real tension between those communities, between the creative arts community and the humanities, between what constitutes what you might say is creative practice. I paint, I perform, and I do that as part of living, or where I produce research in that and what research looks like, and then how it's funded and so on. And there's a real tension that has not been helpful, I think, to the community. And we had quite a bit of a tussle when the Playing to Our Strengths came out, that it was covering the arts, humanities, and social sciences, but still an uncertainty. So greater commonality with other disciplines, prefer using issues about curiosity versus use inspired, but practice-based, you know, because the arts go on a lot about, oh, we're practice-based and the others aren't. Well, that's just not true. Look at the lab sciences, look at engineering, look at all these, you know, these notions of methodologies are not really. So that much more commonality, broaden out what's valued and measured, not just peer-reviewed publications, diverse range, and I come on to something in a moment, and assessing impact because research doesn't exist in isolation. Differs across, we've said all this, but doesn't narrowly have to focus on new products and services, but engaging meaningfully with our varying publics. And one thing I've used or developed, and this is very indicative, but I was trying to indicate to a couple of different audiences at varying times that what's being measured is really the tip of the iceberg. So that's above the red line. So we measure journal articles and we measure a form of peer esteem. But there's all these other types of outputs and the way in which research outputs, and we had this discussion even earlier in the morning session, in a wide range of ways that once we understand what research is, and whether it's translations, visual recordings, patents, all kinds of ways. And on the same way, impact is more than what I've read and what I've written and you've read. And we look increasingly at, which was, I think, just mentioned, again, impact on teaching. I mean, if one of the key functions of research is to underpin teaching, and so that we get enlightened understanding of issues, what are we doing to assess that? Why are we never look at how we're looking at that? improve productivity, inform public debate, new curriculum, policy change, social innovation, stakeholder, a whole range of approaches to how we might look at issues about impact in ways which perhaps are usable on this. I'm going to go look at this thing on the AHRC website. But really widening out this understanding about what it is that we're actually trying to look at. So I'll leave it at that.